Köszöntöm Önöket online, és köszöntöm a jelenlévő nézőket a HVG Green Revolution konferenciáján. Én Marosi Viktor vagyok, az esemény házigazdája és olykor kérdezője. A 2020-as év sokak szerint vízválasztó a világ életében, ugyanakkor nagyon sok új kihívás is érkezett velünk idén, amelyeket olykor derekasan, olykor pedig hanyagul álltunk. A mai konferencia fenntarthatóság jegyében szerveződött, ennek kapcsán rengeteg izgalmas előadás és kerekasztal beszélgetés lesz hallható. Elsőként pedig McCaffrey előadását hallhatják majd angolul, aki az ECOS alapítója, és 20 éve egy olyan tudásközpont létrehozásában vett részt, amely összegyűjti az eddigi tapasztalatokat a klímaváltozás jegyében. Mark, if you hear us, hit the stage, please. Fogadják szeretettel.
So yes, thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts on the Powers of 10 framework, which I'll describe in a minute. And I will be focusing specifically on a paper that was just released in Environmental Research Letters a couple months ago called Powers of 10, Seeking Sweet Spots for Rapid Climate and Sustainability Actions Between Individual and Global Scales, meaning between a single individual and the almost 10 billion people on the planet here. So my co-authors on this paper are Chad Fleischman with Project Drawdown. I'll be sharing a little bit more information about Drawdown in a minute. Avid Bomik at Karlstad University in Sweden, and Abby Ruski with the University of California at Merced. But before I get into the powers of 10, I want to also talk about our superpowers of fractal thinking. And I think many of you are familiar with fractals. These are these mathematically infinite patterns, similar patterns that are both beautiful to look at and also, according to the person who invented the term fractal, Benoît Mandelbrot, he said they were both beautiful and useful. And they're useful as a metaphor, but also mathematically. And as it turns out in artificial intelligence research, they are finding that these basic superpowers that humans have of recognizing novelty and patterns, and also our ability to zoom abstractly in and out of different scales. These are very unique human attributes, and they are mathematical fractal equations that can be used in programming artificial intelligence to mimic these human skills. So I'm really intrigued by this research. There's some interesting TED Talks. There's one on fractal thinking from Keith McGregor at Georgia Tech University that you might be interested in taking a look at. But as we all know from any superhero movie, or any of you who are familiar with the stories of heroes and Greek mythology and so forth, there's often a shadow side, there's often a vulnerability and sometimes a problem with these superhero skills. And in the case of our pattern recognition and our ability to zoom in and out of scales, sometimes maybe we imagine patterns or perceive novelty in patterns that aren't really there, or that are manipulated. And we hear about this in social media, the concern about how social media can be easily manipulated, and some of the conspiracy theories that spin out around various patterns that people imagine that aren't really there. And also we can be limited in terms of the scale and perspective. Sometimes we get hung up on a particular scale, like our ego, or sometimes it's more of a tribal perspective that we're really identifying with, or in some cases nationalism is the scale that we are mostly focused on. And of course, as I mentioned, the internet can be helping drive these sort of fractal fragments and conspiracy theories, which is a real problem. And when it comes to dealing with climate change and all these related issues, I think we need to take a step back and be recognizing that there are these problems with our fractal thinking, that we have certain what have been called carbon traps. In other words, there's things in our social structure and our infrastructure, in our energy systems that make it really hard to go from fossil fuels to alternative energy. In language, we can find reference, like Susan Powell, who's a Hungarian at University of Chicago. She talks about how fractal patterns are sometimes used to bolster ideology, and how that can be a real problem. And also others have talked about how fractal thinking can be perpetuating racism and other problems. So we have these fractal narratives that have been, in some cases, really embedded in our minds, really embedded in society, and we need new ones. And I think that that's really kind of the message that I'd like to bring to you today, is how the Powers of 10 framework can help us rethink who we are and how we can go about making a difference when it comes to climate change and all these related topics of sustainability and equality, equity. So let's start with the question of who do we mean by we, because we can take on all sorts of different meanings. And, for instance, are we talking about who we are as human beings, Homo sapiens? And I think it's helpful to realize that there have actually only been, according to anthropologists, about 100 billion Homo sapiens who have ever lived on the planet. We're the last of a line of about 5 different hominid lineages. We're the only ones that survived, and we've merged in a little bit of Neanderthal DNA and so forth. But that means that 1 out of every 10 humans who has ever lived is alive today, or close to it anyhow, which is kind of mind-boggling. We're heading for 10 billion people by the year 2050. We have organized ourselves into tribes, communities, regions, countries, but they all vary in size, sometimes by multiple orders of magnitude. So actually, when we look at the 193 UN countries, the average size of a country is 38 million people, because we have a couple of countries that are enormous. The median size, in other words, half the countries are larger than 8.8 million, but half of them are smaller. So in other words, Hungary is a little larger than the median. More than half the countries in the world are smaller than Hungary. But we also have megacities, in other words, cities that are more than 10 million people. There's at least 40 of them on the planet, and they have a combined population of more than double the bottom half of the countries in the world. So these top countries, the top 5 countries in the world, China, India, US, Indonesia, Pakistan, account for over half the emissions and over half the global population. And yet, we all too often are comparing one country to another as if they're, comparable by size, but they're not comparable by size. There's sometimes multiple orders of magnitude difference in the size. So the Powers of 10 framework actually came about from this frustration that we use these terms like nations, states, communities, regions, as if we all knew what we were agreeing to in terms of the scale and size of these type of terms that we use. So the Powers of 10 is basically taking the 10 orders of magnitude between a single individual and everybody on the planet, and using that as a natural framework for us to be talking about these scales in a much more kind of precise and holistic way rather than relative way. And of course, they can vary depending on where we are in the world. But in general, this taxonomy can help us maybe be a little more scientific and explicit about the different sizes. Now, interesting point is that logarithmically, the midpoint between a single individual and everybody on the planet is what we call the meta-community scale of about 100,000 people. And so that's the size of a district in Budapest, for example, or an arrondissement in Paris, a colonia in Mexico City, or a section of a county. I live in Nógrád County, which is about 200,000 people. So the northern part of Nógrád County might be about 100,000 people. And again, 100 billion people is the total number of folks who have ever lived on the planet. So moving to our paper that we published in Environmental Research Letters, we present this framework, and it acknowledged that all these scales vary several orders of magnitude sometimes, but there's also these linkages between scales. There's kind of an entanglement so that we can have connections from a single individual up to the global scale, and so forth. You know, it's really quite complicated in some ways, but we wanted to use this framework as a way to sort of have a new, fresh perspective on who we are as human beings. And we started thinking about how can we apply this Powers of 10 framework. And I had been an advisor on Project Drawdown, which I hope many of you are familiar with. HGV has published the Hungarian version of Project Drawdown. There's a new updated website that I'll point to in a minute here. But the term drawdown refers to the point when greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere start to decline. Because as we know, they're continuing to rise, and we're nowhere near, well, hopefully we are near turning the corner on that. So Project Drawdown is looking at the fact that we have all these sources of greenhouse gases from human activities, and we also have natural sinks, plant materials, oceans, and so forth that soak up some of that greenhouse gases. But we have to deal with the fact that in order to start to draw down and turn the corner, not just adding more, but actually getting to the point where we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the concentrations in the atmosphere, we need to reduce, but we also need to sequester that carbon. And the drawdown approach is to look at these systems that we have globally in a very systems-based approach, recognizing that all of these things connect together. Buildings connect to health and education, connect to ocean and land sinks, connect to transportation, and so forth. And I won't dwell too much on the drawdown system other than to say that I would encourage you all to go to drawdown.org, and they have updated information. But to describe briefly what we did is that we took data from Project Drawdown. We looked at 72 of nearly 100 of their climate interventions that range from the transportation sector to the electrical energy sector to agriculture and so forth. And we estimated the range of each of them and then compiled all the data together and came up with a general sense that each one of these interventions can be deployed on different scales, but we wanted to look at both individually and then collectively at where the sweet spots were for deploying these various interventions. So for instance, rooftop solar works well on single houses on up to maybe apartment buildings, whereas utility scale solar arrays will be efficient at a larger number of people. And that's just one example. But so the drawdown system has identified all these different ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon. Reduced food waste is actually number one if we're looking at getting down to 2 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. But of course, the Paris Agreement was that we were going to try to get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And that would require a much more robust effort, a lot more wind turbines and utility scale solar voltaics. But again, food waste, moving more to a plant-rich diet and so forth are really important, as are everything else. I mean, we can't do it just with those alone. We have to have a very holistic approach. Also, the drawdown approach completely dovetails with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I know many of you are familiar with. So again, I would encourage you all to look at the Drawdown website and get some updated information. And of course, take a look at the Drawdown book in Hungarian for those of you who are interested in learning more about the project. But the point here is that people themselves are agents for climate action. You know, we tend to look at governments as the place where we need to have action implemented, and in a way that's been part of the problem of the approach in the past 20 or 30 years, is that we've relied pretty much just on governments to take the action. But in fact, individuals have an important role to play. Our collective agency is really important, and I'm going to emphasize that in a minute here. And then also we can take action, or others can take action for us. In other words, it's a kind of form of proxy agency, and that's important too, especially for vulnerable communities. You know, half the people in the world are very, very vulnerable because you know, the top 1% of people on the planet who are wealthy and have high emissions have as many emissions as the bottom half of humanity, who are very vulnerable. So just to kind of wrap up here, the approach of the Powers of 10 framework is that we need to go beyond just relying on nation states to take action. You know, that's been kind of the modus operandi of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Nations are important, let's not diminish that, but they haven't been able to do the job, frankly. You know, we've relied on countries. The countries have said they would do things, and then they didn't follow through on things. And some of that's a problem of the politics, but it's also an issue of scale. And what I'd like to point out here, this is over on the left, it's individual contributions based on our data from using Project Drawdown interventions on up to the subcontinental scale of 10 to the 8th power, or what we call P8. And what we find is actually where the biggest action is, where the largest number of climate interventions are, and where the highest number of greenhouse gases can be reduced, is at that community, meta-community, and urban scale of 10,000 to 1 million people. So climate action matters at all scales, but I think we need to really be thinking more about what we can do at this community to urban scale. Urban doesn't necessarily mean big cities. I think it can also apply to rural areas where we need to transform agriculture and the systems in rural communities. So we are pleased that the Powers of 10 framework is already being used in education. There was a paper that came out a couple months ago looking at roadblocks to quality education in a time of climate change that's used this Powers of 10 framework. Karen O'Brien at the University of Oslo has referred to Powers of 10 in her recent book on called You Matter More Than You Think, which is about quantum social theory, including a whole section on fractals that you might be interested in. And I think for me, one of the most exciting things is that the ultimate sweet spot is you. In other words, at this scale of one single person, or what we call P0, 10 to the 0 power, that's really where the action is. We are the sweet spots, each of us individually. We have much more agency and ability to act and take action than we know, and knowing that the community scale, at that community to urban scale, is where we can actually get the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. We human beings collectively, I think, can rethink how we are approaching climate action and interventions. But ultimately, let's not be too anthropocentric about this. You know, this is focused on human beings and Homo sapiens, including all the human beings who have ever lived. But we are obviously connected to the rest of the universe. And so we can also talk about a P to the infinity power, which would include all our relations, all the other species on the planet, all the ecosystems, and then ultimately all the matter and energy that's in the universe. So I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Victor, and please contact me and check out our organization, ECOS, Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholders, if you're interested in more information.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Let me ask a few questions about your presentation. You were talking about superheroes and all the methods of the Drawdown project. But also, I'd like to ask you about the method of approaching people, because the method this is not the only method we know about climate change. Definitely a very complex one. But what is the method to break through the stick wall in communication to approach the people? Because we hear about climate change every day. In the news, in the television, on internet, we have several websites about climate change. Everybody has their own view. Of course, we have the deniers as well. But basically, how can we go through the stick wall, and how can we approach the people? How can we get them into action on the matter of climate change?
That's a great question, Victor. Thank you. I think that based on our research and my own experience, I think the action really is at that community scale that we need to be thinking about. So who are we communicating with? Are we just communicating to our uncle who doesn't believe in climate change and we're trying to convince him that this is a serious thing? Or is that sort of a waste of time? I think actually, in the case of Hungary, Hungary takes climate change relatively seriously. There are plans to become carbon-free by 2030, and that'll be a big job, obviously, because there's still a coal-fired electrical plant over near Gingis. But there's so much more that can be done, especially at these community scales. So, for instance, if you live in Budapest, think about organizations at the district level, your district government, or maybe even the municipal government. But again, I think there's so much more that we can do at these more local scales. It's a more human scale. Yes, it's good to lobby at the national level, at the international level. That's all important, and some of us have more of an ability to do that than others. But all of us have the ability to go down to our mayor's office and say, what can we do to reduce food waste? Again, food waste is one of those areas that we don't even think about as related to climate change oftentimes. But oftentimes we have food waste in our own everyday lives. And then at a larger scale, what about the supermarkets and the food markets around town? What happens with all that food that is not sold and ends up being wasted? In other parts of the world, the food waste is actually more in the fields where they can't get the produce to market, and it ends up rotting because they don't have refrigeration and so forth. That's just one suggestion I could make. That when it comes to communication, we need to be communicating at a scale and with the people who can actually make a difference. And there's so much we can do in our everyday lives, rather than like the climate protests that we had here in Hungary and all over the world, really, back last year before the coronavirus. It was good to protest. It was good to make a showing that this is important to us. But those same people can go back into their communities and be thinking about what can we do to support, district heating, for instance, which is a really important tool in urban areas that is often overlooked. What can we do to push for more solar energy and wind energy and so forth in our own communities? So those are just a few thoughts.
Yes, this was about the individual decisions, and excuse me in advance because I bring a little bit in the political questions, because I think that the what we get every day as informations about what happens around us, that's a big responsibility of politics, and of course it's different how the politics take it more serious. It's a difference between nations, but I think that's a big question how to approach, because now we kind of know how to approach people and how to approach our immediate surroundings, but but that's a question, because I think at the end of the day, we need to get leaders in these questions. So so that's the next and in the same time the last questions. How to approach political the political members, political community about these kind of questions, how to make change. And the next guest is with us already. I don't know if she hears us. Do you hear us? Yes, now I hear
absolutely,
you.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. So actually, this last
Just say one
question.
last thing before we sign off here, and Diana, it's great to see you. But one last comment is that I think you in Hungary, you know more about Hungarian politics than I ever will, but I think you're in a really exciting opportunity. You're at a scale that's not too big and not too small. You do have strong support for climate action in the president's office in particular. And you know, the work of Kuroshi Chaba is just remarkable over the years, helping develop the sustainable development goals and so forth. You know, my one suggestion to work in Hungary is to be thinking about this sort of meta community scale of 100,000 people. So the whole country could be sort of divided into segments of about 100,000 people, and there would be about 100 of them. And of course, Budapest is easy because the districts are all about 100,000 people. And so they're already sort of naturally broken down into these segments of sort of meta community segments. So, you know, there's so much that could be done in terms of outreach and having community hubs for sharing information and demonstrating renewable energy and sustainable practices and so forth. You know, at that scale, that's really human. It's not too big. It's not too small. It's very kind of intimate in a certain way, but it's also at a scale that has a big impact globally. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So actually, this last question was trying to tie the new subject, the new topic, to our previous one, to your presentation. And let me introduce the Hungarian audience. Let me introduce Dr. Ürge Forsac Diana. And I'm sorry about that in Hungarian, and then she will continue in Hungarian.